Hello, Bringing Home the W listeners, Tanya here. And before we get into today's episode, I wanted to jump on quick and provide a bit of an update because a lot has happened since we recorded this episode. So first things first, submissions are officially closed. Over 1,100 cities and towns across Canada submitted for nameyourteam.ca, and that's an amazing number because I don't even know that many cities and towns existed in Canada. So it just seems that we truly touched all different parts of this country, and this truly is Canada's team. After submissions closed, a creative council of designers and influential Canadians got together to shortlist the names, and they're just blown away by the imagination, creativity, and care that you all put into submitting your names and ideas. So thank you so much for doing that. That's awesome. We couldn't have done it, literally could not have done this without you. Now we're in the trademark phase where we're seeing which of these ideas and names could actually work for the WNBA Toronto team. And then we get to do the fun stuff. We're going to bring in some designers and start fleshing out these ideas and bringing them to life. So I'm going to keep you posted on all that. Don't you worry. Also in this episode, we're going to meet Josh McConnell and welcome him to Bringing Home the W. He's a former journalist. He's a big basketball guy and our inside man at the creative agency working with WNBA Toronto to bring this team name to life. So he'll be a great resource, and I'm so happy he's along for the ride. I'm thrilled for you to listen to this episode of the podcast. Episode 2 is up now. You got all of the updates, so I hope you enjoy. Welcome to today's episode of Bringing Home the W, where we're diving deeper into the fascinating world of naming a sports team. A name carries the weight of identity, culture, and connection, especially in a diverse country like Canada. So we're very excited to explore this further and dive deeper. So we've brought in the experts. I have the affiliate leagues lead for the National Basketball Association's on-court and brand partnerships, Tawan Watson. Welcome to the show, Tawan.
I appreciate it. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. So tell me a little bit more about what exactly an affiliate leagues lead for the NBA does.
Yeah, absolutely. A mouthful. Again, Tawan Watson. Hello to everyone. Been at the NBA for going on 9 seasons at this point, and I've been with my team since I've graduated, just in different roles and capacities, but specifically Affiliate Leagues League. So for those that don't know, we actually have 5 properties at the NBA. The NBA, the WNBA, the NBA G League, which is our developmental league, the 2K League, which is our gaming property, and then newly founded Basketball Africa League. And so from an affiliate leagues perspective, that's everything outside of the NBA, right? So we have a team that works on NBA work, and then we have a team that is dedicated to the affiliate leagues. So that's how we're structured. And then from an on-court and brand partnerships perspective, again, it's twofold, right? You have the on-court piece, and then you have the brand component. On-court, topic for today's session, we help nurture and develop new team identities, right? So anytime a team changes their logo, their look, or if there's a new expansion team coming on, we're involved in that process pretty mightily to make sure that we're delivering for that team, and then we work with them in perpetuity to make sure we're protecting their marks so that those can be leveraged in the accurate way from a licensed product standpoint and in a digital space.
So it seems like you and your team, you're the man with the plan. Toronto's been named the new home for this WNBA team, and so how does your team foster that, and what's your team and your role for this partnership?
Absolutely.
Not even partnership, sorry, this new team.
It is a partnership. It is a partnership. We like to think of our relationships with teams as partnerships for sure. So that is accurate. So our role is pretty much the shepherds of the process, right? Meaning we have guardrails, we have concepts, objectives, subjective truths that we like to stick by and sort of help teams as they welcome themselves into the league, right, and start to create their brand work. And so part of our process is to ensure that process happens. It comes through smoothly, hopefully on time, right? Time is of the essence. And then ultimately, we want to deliver those final name, logo, assets, colorations, all of those components to our official licensees and marketing partners so that they can then activate. That's the partnership, and that's the tug and pull that typically happens with a naming process and logo creation.
I see. And so in terms of those guardrails, you sort of set the world that WNBA Toronto can play in.
Yes.
So what are some of those things, those considerations?
Absolutely. There's probably three things that I think of immediately when it comes to, let's call them guardrails or brand truths. One is more objective in nature, right? And that's, does that team name exist in any major sport league across the
Are we going to get sued?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like and more so, I wouldn't say more importantly, but from a new team perspective, you want to make sure whatever you do and your name, your logo, it's completely unique and ownable to you, right? Like, I know from a person standpoint, there's plenty of people out here with shared names, but we're dealing with the elite level of competition, right? And brands that we want to be recognizable and eliminate confusion. If you're talking about, hey, we're going to this game, are you talking about that sport? Are you talking about baseball or any other sport? That's one. Two, going back to your point, getting sued, let's not do that. And that's where we work with our IP team, intellectual property, to ensure that whatever we're doing or whatever names are in consideration, we can actually use across product and promotional material, right? It doesn't make sense to probably have that name if we can't activate it on product or there's a lot of limitations and we can't use it in promotional use, right? It's just limiting in nature. And then the last one is more subjective, audibly, just how does it sound? When you're speaking the name, is it easy? Does it roll off the tongue?
Can children say it?
Exactly, right?
And how does it sound in being chanted by an arena?
Yep, in context, right? And so all of those things are the components we think about. Again, some are more objectives than others, but we put that in the blender. We use that as a filter to get down to hopefully that one name that we're all excited about.
Do you have some overarching values that you're sort of, tied to that are pillars for the vision with the league as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, a lot of it too comes down to the team and their objectives that they want to get across. What are we trying to achieve here, right? Are we trying to speak to a hyper-local community specifically? Do we want to speak to the broader landscape globally? You can do both, but like having that clear understanding of where you want to start is imperative to how you get to the foundation and core of your name. So let's define what a team name is, specifically in our ecosystem, right? There's really two components. So the first component is a location identifier, right? What's your origin? What's your region? Most instances in our league, it's city or state, and obviously we're in Toronto now, country.
Toronto.
Clearly I haven't been back since.
We'll get there.
Yeah, so your location identifier, right? That identifies and ties you to a specific area of the world. That's the first. Second is your nickname, right? And again, some of this may seem self-explanatory, but these principles are vital to understand. And it's part of what we do when we're engaging with teams early on. Let's just level the playing field and define what it means to speak about a team name. And so your nickname could be anything, right? Like within rules, but is it weather related? Is it an abstract idea or concept? Is it a mythological creature, right? Like there's so many different ways you can go. But again, that's why I want to drive back to your objectives. What are you trying to get across? Because sometimes you can't attack everything, right? And so you have to have that sole focus of, regardless of what happens, this is who we are.
It seems like such a monumental task. So I appreciate how WNBA Toronto and Teresa Resch, of course, wanted to do this Name Your Team campaign. Has this ever been done before?
Yeah, so we've done naming contests before in different capacities and in different concepts and ideas. I think the beautiful thing about it, and typically what happens, I kind of alluded to this before, it all comes down to timing, right? The more timing you have, the better you probably are in like really sifting through different options, right? But I will say, like, that's imperative, at least in my eyes, subjectively. If you can bring additional voices into the space to ensure that you're at least turning over every stone, why not? I think the collaborative approach, to me, wins every time.
There's always going to be people who don't like it. There's always going to be haters.
Yeah.
The world is a fickle thing. Last week, everyone was brat. This week, everyone's demure and mindful. Who knows what we're doing here?
Yep.
So in that sense, like, how do you know, I guess, when you've reached the right name? what will be that aha moment of like, yes, this is it?
For me, it's very simple. Is there an emotional connection to that name? But then also, too, again, what are your values, right? Like, if you can come into a conversation or come to a consensus or a decision to say, this is why we did what we did, everybody's going to have an opinion. And some people may like it, some people may not. What we say all the time is we want to make you feel, right? Like, we're in the business, branding is a business of emotional engagement and connectivity. If I can make you feel positive or negative, I have you connected. Right. And hopefully we can convert some of those negative sentiments into positive by sharing our story. But that starts with understanding your why. So if you can understand your why, you can communicate the how and what we're trying to achieve. I like to think that we can have some success there.
How much, if at all, does looking ahead also influence the process? And knowing that this is a team that's coming in 2026, and then looking ahead to some of the technologies that's available, does any of that impact this decision, or do you try to kind of stay within what you have to work with now?
It impacts it mightily. To be honest, we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't have a foresight into what's next. I give you an example, right? Like, with the inclusion of Toronto, right? We're at 14 WNBA teams. I don't think we're done. I don't think we're done, right? And there's growth out there. And so from a landscape perspective, we at least want to have that vision to say, okay, if we're at 14 now, at some point in the future, if we grow, does this name still hold true, right? Like, are we stepping on our toes by only thinking just of Toronto, right? When it comes to just building the brand. And so we always want to think ahead about what's to come potentially, technology, right? Like, how does this integrate? Jumping ahead to logo, how does this reduce down the size, right? Like, so we're always trying to look around the corners to try to uncover what we can. And hopefully the brand will then stand the test of time because we've pressure tested the concept, right, at every turn versus, okay, we'll go through it. We'll look at it from today's standpoint, but today isn't tomorrow. And if we haven't had that conversation, we're probably short-sighting the team that we're working with.
So also a fortune teller, basically, looking ahead. You kind of do have to tell the future, especially with technology and how fast it's moving. And I did want to ask a little bit about, because there is affiliates for, like, there's the Washington Wizards, the Washington Mystics on the WNBA side. So they have that connection.
Yes.
We have the Toronto Raptors, Toronto Pterodactyls. No, stuff like, is there any onus that there has to be some sort of connection there? There's
not. But again, the key is understanding that there can be, right? And this is where we talked about guardrails at the opening. We like to at least level the playing field and understand the landscape in which we operate. Some teams may lean into that, which is perfectly fine. Some teams may not, for valid reasons, right? You can say, hey, I want to establish a separate identity. We love the connection with our NBA brethren, but this is the direction we want to go. Or we want to leverage the equity of our NBA team and play that up a bit and see where that can take us. So again, it goes back to the objectives of the team and what you're trying to get across. There's multiple ways that you can sort of solve this riddle.
The WNBA, obviously, right now, it's got a tremendous amount of momentum. And how do you feel, if at all, that's changed kind of your role and the interest from sponsors and other corporate entities that might get involved along the way and along the process and creating this initial groundswell around new teams?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I kind of go back to what I mentioned in terms of our process, where I don't think we view the WNBA any differently than what we did before in terms of how intentful or passionate or thorough we've been with any other team prior to this moment. It's just there's more eyes on it, but it doesn't change how we approach it, And so I think that's been key to our process. Yes, there's probably more individuals that we can weigh things by or that may ingratiate themselves in the process, sure. But it doesn't change the foundation and the core at which we attack the work, right? We're always going to attack it with focus, diligently, with rigor, because the teams deserve it, right? We owe that to them.
And it reflects on the greater league as well, right?
Yeah. And that's a good point, right? Because if at some point, right, for whatever reason, that wasn't the case, now when the light turns on, we kind of have a mess, right?
Yeah.
Like, no. We want to make sure when it's time to show up, we're showing up, right? In the most authentic, organic way to represent each team in the league in the best manner possible. So it's great. Again, the uptick in interest is great across the board, across all metrics. But I think we take pride in the fact that we've thought this way about the beautiful game of the WNBA dating back to the inception.
I want to know, you've been doing this a long time. You've helped lots of teams along the way.
Yes.
So what are some big lessons that you've learned?
Ooh, that's a golden question. First thing that comes to mind for me is, again, an adage of our on-court and brand partnerships team is measure twice, cut once, right? And so I've seen it time and time again where you kind of wish maybe you sort of got lucky that time and like we kind of dodged one there. But when you do that, you can sleep better at night knowing that you try to do as much as you can to put yourself in the best position to succeed. And you've engaged individuals. Now is the time. It's showtime, right? It's time we can go out with our story. We've done a lot of homework. We've prepared, and we're ready to take that shot.
Good analogy.
Basketball analogy.
You'll get a slam dunk after that. I'm excited to see where we go with this.
Me too. We're excited. Thanks for the opportunity and for the conversation.
So we just learned about some high-level parameters that the WNBA would set for a WNBA Toronto team. And now, dear listeners, I told you we're going to dive in. We're diving deeper now. We're going right to the source. We are talking to the design mentor and naming criteria vetting lead of the WNBA Toronto identity team, Dr. Anna Rita Moraes. Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing really great, but you are boots on the ground, let's say. Well, why don't you tell me what you're doing?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. So we are currently sorting through, as an ongoing process, all of the submissions, the many wonderful submissions that have been submitted by Canadians and sports enthusiasts across the globe to help name this team. So really a lot to sort through, a lot to understand the meaning of, a lot to do a little bit of research on to understand what is the reference of this word, etymologically, what does this mean? Where does the semantics of this come from? That kind of thing. So
I definitely want to dive deeper into, the process on your end, but I also didn't want to sell you short because you definitely have an eye for design. You are the interim dean for the Center for Arts Design and Information Technology and the associate dean of the School of Design at George Brown College. But have you ever done something like this before?
Absolutely not on this scale. I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of amazing design agencies and networks and organizations across Toronto, but nothing on this scale and nothing that sort of encompasses this many people into the same sort of ecosystem. So you're asking folks who are sports enthusiasts, you're asking folks who are not brand specialists, not brand strategists to come to the table and say, hey, I really want to see a name like this reflected in a team that is going to mean so much to me, right? And so as a situated team in Toronto, that's huge, but it's also going to have a wide-ranging impact on how we perceive women's sports in Canada. So I think getting it right is an important thing. Being really focused on detail, being really focused on curiosity is like paramount to this process. So that's making a huge leap into how we approach this.
It sounds like the right people so far are in place for, I guess, going through this, the vetting of the submissions that you're receiving. So can you talk to me a little bit more about sort of the criteria that you're using to whittle down those 10,000 suggestions? Like what specifically is your team looking for or definitely not looking for?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think both of those things are just as important, right? In terms of the actual criteria itself, so we did a first pass at all of the submissions. We looked at the duplicates. We put things together. Were there names that you have a plural version and then a singular version. Are those the same thing? Do they carry different meanings? So that was the first pass. Second pass was, does this thing or this entity or this name already exist for a major sports league? And then we rank things. We rank things against a set of criteria. And that criteria has sort of 7 different aspects that we consulted with the WNBA Toronto team to understand, are these, the most important things that we can capture with Canadians. And none of these criteria are more important than another. Part of it is an understanding that no one name is going to do everything for everyone, nor is it going to neatly fit into criteria. But we have gotten really close with some of the names that we have really taken to that have been submitted. So the first is this understanding of what is the relevance and connection to Toronto and the region at large, right? So thinking about the Toronto context, thinking about local context, is it landmark specific? Does it have a historical context? Do we have specific groups of people that are well represented by this? The second is around inclusivity and sensitivity. So trying to maintain gender neutrality. We want something that speaks to everybody, as much as obviously this is a WNBA team. We also want that fan base to be wide ranging. We want people to see themselves reflected not only in the league, but in the teams as well. And then that sensitivity piece is really around, could this word have some negative connotation that we don't know about?
I'm sure there's like flubs that have happened in the past, like examples of like they didn't do their research or their due diligence on this team name. And
yeah, and even with this idea is like there's, I've said this a few times, like you can control what your name is, but it's difficult to control what people call you, right? So you really have to go through this alliteration process of like selecting a name and then kind of beating it up a bit, right?
And you can't be too tied to one name like that. As part of that team, you have to kind of kill your babies.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this idea around like killing your darlings is definitely like a big piece of this for sure. By that same token, one of the other big criteria items is around uniqueness and distinction, right? So like, how does this distinguish itself from the other teams in the WNBA? Does it lend itself well to that ecosystem, or is it so sort of off the maps, which, in some ways could be a good thing, but in some ways you also want it to have like, a bit of a nice craft with the teams that it's going to play with. Thinking a little bit about team values and team vision, right? So being the first, being something that is new to this space within the national context is huge, and understanding the values of the WNBA Toronto team and what's important to those folks and how we can make sure that we're doing their needs and their desires justice as well. And then obviously there's a massive marketing and branding potential here, right? So clarity is huge here. When you hear the name, do you understand right away what it is, or do you have to Google that? Is it something that you are going to want to see on a shirt thing, right? And I think part of it is again, rallying people, having people feel like they belong to the team, having people feel like they've contributed positively to the building of this brand system, right? And then the last two are really around the fans and who's out there, right? So fan engagement. How pumped are people going to be to, like not only rock this merch, but also have an understanding of like, I'm going to travel down to the city. I'm going to stand outside and, I'm going to be part of the fan zone and that kind of thing. So that's a huge aspect there. And then the global appeal, right? So how do we reach an audience beyond Toronto? How do we reach an audience beyond Canada? And not from a capitalist perspective, but like how do we embrace that with everything that we can, and an understanding that like we all deserve a place to play.
So lots to think about. Like,
yeah.
You have your majors, you're like, and you have to keep connecting it back.
There were a lot of submissions for Raptors, Raptorettes, raptures, that kind of idea. There were a lot of like very punny names, which I love a pun.
Yeah.
Love a pun, right? The headlines don't love a pun,
No.
like when you're doing great, they'll love you with the pun, and when you're not, they will murder you with it. So I think that part is important. But the sort of inventiveness of the names is really interesting.
There was no Bodie McBoatface.
There was no Bodie McBoatface. So that was obviously, that is like going to be a concern when you say to people like, hey, you name this thing, right? You know, like it's like asking, your child to name their like younger sibling, and the name that they pick is something that you're like, no, not going on the birth document.
Going to the internet for opinions is dangerous.
One of the things that I had asked when I started to look through all of the submissions was, what were the filters that you put on? And the team was like, what do you mean? And I said, like, oh, there's like no swear words. There's nothing that is like overtly offensive. And they're like, we didn't put any parameters on them. And I was like, this is so Canadian. This is like this really beautiful thing where other than a couple of people that were obviously just being kind of goofy, nothing that was like overly
trolling.
No.
Wow,
which is really lovely.
I do love that.
It was nice. Yeah.
That's
it's the feel good for sure. Yeah, it was very wholesome.
Is there, I like that you've spoken a bit, and Josh, our friend Josh here, has given us some numbers about the types of names that you've been receiving. There's, I think it was like 7% is sort of Indigenous names. And of course, if there's French names or how that's going to, because we're Canada's team, but so you don't want to be too Toronto-centric, but you don't want to be too, I don't know. It's a big task. I'm glad you're on it.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act, and I think part of that task is also having an understanding of like your own blind spots, right? So like that's one thing that my team has been sort of checking in on an ongoing basis is like this specific word or this specific thing has this kind of meaning to me. What does it mean to you?
Just to follow up, in thinking about all the submissions and everything, we have roughly, I'm just looking at the stats here, but 17% of the submissions included an image as well. And obviously this is more than just naming a team, it's naming an identity. In your point of this process, how much has the imagery and other pieces to the submission playing a role in your step of this process?
The imagery, the piece around like imagery submission has been really interesting and I think a really nice piece for us to have to be able to reference. And I think some of those images are really focused on like, these are the colors that I really like. This is what, for me embodies some of what this name means or what it could mean. And, I think that piece of like color theory research is really interesting for designy nerds like me. But there's so many submissions that were also like photos of people at like a sporting event with their parent or their child. And like, it was like super emotional. So like looking at some of that stuff, you can see and you can start to formulate how people are going to, sort of live out being a fan base for this team, right? And what this means to them to be able to submit something like that.
As it stands now, are there any sort of major challenges and things that you faced in this journey so far? Was there any fighting? Did you have to
no, so definitely
fisticuffs? I don't know.
No fighting, but I think you want to get it right. You really want to get it right, and I think research can tell you a lot of things, but once you hit send and it goes to press, and the public finds out that the name is this. There's going to be a lot of people that are thrilled and there's going to be a lot of people that are less thrilled, right? And so how do you manage? And I think part of that, again, goes back to trusting the process, right? So I feel solid about the criteria we put together. We talked about it for, several weeks. We went back to the WNBA team. I think part of that understanding of like coming up with consensus with a really robust team of lots of different thought leaders from lots of different places is really, really important, right? But I think also just recognizing that like we know there are going to be some people that won't love it, and that's okay. We'll convert them once we hit the court. That's totally fine.
How will you know that you got it right, or when you've gotten it right?
Oh, that's a great question. I think we've already gotten it right without naming it. And I think that that's the case just based on the process, based on the amount of people that the folks at Metal have engaged, based on how mindful WNBA Toronto is being about this process and how authentic they're being about this process. I think you can look at things like jersey sales or ticket sales or whatever the case may be, but we already know that that's going to happen because we already know how excited the fan base is. So to me, I think we've gotten it right when there is essentially butts in seats and people are excited about this team, right? And it doesn't matter what the team is necessarily called. I think the fact that Toronto has rallied and spoken very loudly that we want this thing, I think that sort of speaks volumes.
And people, they love and appreciate transparency. Even something like this podcast, that we are peeling away the curtain and allowing for people to see what this little adventure that is happening with naming this team
totally
is like, and talking to people with the firsthand experience like you, I think it will go a long way.
And I think it's also, like from a historical context, For those that may not know, like 30 years ago, Toronto went out and did the exact same thing to name the Toronto Raptors, right? So they went out to the public and said, hey, help us name this team, right? And so I think the ability to go back to Canadians, 3 decades later and say, hey, we're back. And now we want you to help us again, right? And I think that there's something really beautiful, again, about that community piece and that connection piece and recognizing the value of inclusive voices, right? And, this team very well could have said, hey, we're going to, hire a series of like strategists and brand specialists, and we're going to name the team in a closed door with 10 people. And they have absolutely not done that. They've sort of smashed the perspective on how this could be done for lots of folks. And I think for me personally, I find it very inspiring to approach design in this way that I think is more inclusive, more open, and that says to people, come be part of this conversation, right? And I think one of the things that was important to us at the beginning was like nothing for Canadians without Canadians, right? So how do we bring people to the table and how do we get people excited about it, right?
Again, it's a monumental task that I'm glad it's you.
So we kind of like touched on it a little bit, but obviously this is a big discussion around the name, and this is a big component of it. However, it's also about identity. It's also about various marketing opportunities. And I'm just curious if you could like just hone in a little bit on when you think about the brand and marketing side, like what do you think of? Are you going through the process and being like, that would make a good mascot? How much is that a factor?
It's an interesting question. And I think for me, that's kind of where my mind goes, right? Is like, what does this thing look like as an identity, right? So again, what are the colors? What are the brand space it lives in? I think the mascot piece is really interesting, right? So like there's some pretty amazing WNBA mascots, and I would love for Toronto to have a really good mascot. And that's sometimes easier to see with certain animals, certain names than it is with others,
sure.
right? So if it's an animal,
Literal.
then there it is, right? This is the tangible thing. But when the name is a bit more abstract, you start to think about like, okay, what are some curious elements that we can kind of fold in to make this mascot, right? And I think that those pieces are really interesting. And it's difficult to think, obviously, about a name without thinking about all the things that it means and what it represents, whether that's in color or, in some sort of like 3D kind of realm. I think, even just thinking about like brand sponsorship and this kind of thing, right? So like what local organizations, local businesses, local pop-ups, that kind of thing, can you work with in Toronto that like have like so much talent, bring so much to the table from a local context, and how can you sort of elevate some of those things and find really solid partnerships together, right?
I love that this is all part of your interrogation process with this name and this identity. I get a sense that you're covering all your bases. Bases are baseball.
Yeah.
We need a basketball. You're covering all the key. You're not standing in the key for too long, or I don't know.
That's fair. We're not traveling. We're trying to maintain and do as much due diligence as we can while also being authentic, right? Rules are rules. Sometimes rules are made to be broken within appropriate context, right? So I think there's that balance between taking a risk, a calculated risk, and then also being mindful of the fact that like, hey, we have, as a council, sort of gone through what these parameters look like, and they exist for specific reasons.
What's been the most interesting part of this campaign or this process for you so far, or the thing that you've enjoyed the most, maybe?
I think as a person that works with a lot of designers, I'm always interested to see the process other people take on, right? And I think part of that is like, that's how we grow as humans, right? So it's amazing to see a group of people in a room do something in a way that I haven't seen it done before. And I think selfishly that helps me grow and that helps me build on what I want to do. And part of the work that I do is really working with a lot of young designers, right? And folks that are, sort of coming into the creative industries for the first time, and that they want to take calculated risks and they want to have an understanding of, what is the landscape that I'm going to start to work in. And I think it's important to pass some of that knowledge on and to do a little bit of like knowledge translation. So I think there's a massive element there of understanding that someone else at the table has some piece of knowledge that you don't have.
I'm hearing never stop learning.
Yeah.
And the fact that I think the best leaders or the smartest people know that they don't know anything, or
yes.
And they know that they look to other people that maybe they admire and to learn and take pieces from. So it does sound like, I mean, collaboration, I think, is the word of the day.
But then I also think it's really important to look at the other side of things, right? And like, again, having a lens on something that looks very different because you're trained in a specific way is really paramount. I think also like inclusive voices is a huge element, right? So like making space for designers and strategists and thought leaders of color, I think is really, really, really important. And I know that that the team at Metal has done a tremendous job of this. And I think, we owe it to designers and we owe it to the public to continue to do this work because there's so much that gets left behind when you don't bring people into the room that, traditionally have been sort of left on the outside of those conversations.
And it reflects the wider, like, we're such a, multicultural country as well. The WNBA, their core values of the league is so, inclusive and trailblazing and active and, knowledgeable about world events and things. And it's not just about on court, it's off court as well. So it does, I think we're in really good hands with you, Rita. And I thank you so much for giving your time and sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I feel the excitement. It's mutual. So.